The North Atlantic, March 16, 1943. Convoy HX-229 stretched across 12 miles of gray ocean. 40 merchant ships loaded with aviation fuel, ammunition, and food for Britain, protected by just 4 corvettes and 2 destroyers. Lieutenant Commander James McIntyre stood on the bridge of HMS Volunteer, one of the escort destroyers, watching the merchant ships wallow through 15-foot swells. The glass of his binoculars was spotted with salt spray, and ice was forming on the ship's rigging despite the calendar claiming it was nearly spring. Through his headphones came the steady ping of the Aztec sonar, searching for submarines that everyone knew were out there, somewhere beneath the cold Atlantic waters. McIntyre had been hunting U-boats since 1940, 3 years that had aged him a decade. He knew the statistics better than most. By March 1943, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be built. The previous November had been the worst month of the war, with 729,160 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Britain needed to import 60 million tons of supplies per year to survive. The U-boats were sinking ships at a rate that would starve Britain into submission by the end of 1943. Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat fleet had grown to over 400 submarines, with more than 100 operational in the Atlantic at any given time. They hunted in wolf packs, coordinated by radio from U-boat command in Lorient, France, converging on convoys like sharks drawn to blood. Convoy HX-229 had departed New York on March 8, 1943, bound for Liverpool with desperately needed supplies. The convoy consisted of 40 merchant ships of various nationalities. American Liberty ships fresh from the shipyards, British freighters that had survived multiple Atlantic crossings, Norwegian tankers carrying high-octane aviation fuel, Dutch cargo vessels loaded with steel and aluminum for aircraft production. The smallest ship displaced 4,000 tons. The largest, the tanker Southern Princess, displaced 12,156 tons and carried enough fuel to keep the RAF flying for a week. Together, the convoy represented over 300,000 tons of shipping, crewed by nearly 2,000 merchant seamen who knew that their life expectancy if torpedoed in the North Atlantic was measured in minutes, not hours. The escort force for HX-229 was pathetically inadequate for the task. HMS Volunteer, McIntyre's destroyer, was a V-class destroyer built in 1919, a veteran of the First World War pressed back into service. She displaced 1,090 tons, could make 34 knots in ideal conditions, though her worn engines now struggled to maintain 25 knots. Her armament consisted of 4 4-inch guns, 1 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, and depth charge racks. The destroyer HMS Beverly was even older, converted from an American 4-stack destroyer transferred to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The 4 Flower-class corvettes HMS Anemone, HMS Pennywort, HMS Abelia, and HMS Sherbrooke were sturdy little ships of 925 tons, but they could barely make 16 knots, too slow to chase surfaced U-boats that could make 17 knots on diesel engines. The convoy had already lost 2 ships to weather. The Liberty ship Hugh Williamson had developed cracks in her hull during a storm on March 14 and had turned back for Halifax. The Norwegian freighter Abraham Lincoln had simply disappeared during the night of March 15, probably broken in half by the massive waves. No distress signal, no survivors, just an empty space in the convoy formation discovered at dawn. The merchant captains were nervous, constantly sending lamp signals asking for position confirmations, breaking radio silence with weather reports. Every unnecessary transmission was a beacon for the U-boats, but McIntyre couldn't blame them. These weren't Navy men trained for war. They were civilian sailors who had volunteered or been conscripted to sail through the most dangerous waters on Earth. B-Dienst, the German Naval Intelligence Service, had broken the British Naval Cipher No. 3 and knew exactly where Convoy HX-229 was heading. On March 15, U-Boat Command had ordered Wolfpack Robgraf 11 U-boats to form a patrol line across the convoy's expected route. The submarines spread out 40 miles apart, submerged during daylight, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and transmit contact reports. U-653, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Gerhard Feiler, was the first to make contact. At 0800 hours on March 16, Feiler spotted smoke on the horizon through his periscope. He surfaced briefly to confirm visual contact, counting masts and funnels, estimating the convoy's course and speed. His radio operator transmitted the sighting report to U-Boat Command, Convoy Grid Square BD 1491. Course 070, speed 9 knots, 40-plus merchants, weak escort. Within hours, U-Boat Command was vectoring every available submarine toward HX-229. Wolf-Pack Sturmer, 8 boats that had been tracking another convoy, was ordered to abandon its pursuit and race toward HX-229. Wolf-Pack Dranger, 11 more U-boats, was ordered to intercept. By nightfall on March 16th, 30 German submarines were converging on convoy HX-229. The merchant ships and their escorts didn't know it yet, but they were sailing into the largest Wolf-Pack concentration of the war. The first attack came at 2,200 hours on March 16th. U-603, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Bertelsmann, had crept through the escort screen on the surface, invisible in the darkness. The convoy was zigzagging according to pattern number 8, changing course every 30 minutes, but Bertelsmann had been tracking them for 3 hours and had figured out the pattern. He fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from his bow tubes at a range of 800 meters. 2 torpedoes struck the Norwegian freighter LNK, carrying 7,000 tons of wheat and steel. The ship exploded in a pillar of flame that illuminated the entire convoy. The LNK broke in half and sank in less than 3 minutes. Of her crew of 41, only 3 survived, pulled from the freezing water hours later by the corvette HMS Anemone. The explosion was the signal for the Wolf-Pack to attack. U-boats approached from every direction, running on the surface at maximum speed, their gray hulls invisible against the dark ocean. U-758 put 2 torpedoes into the Liberty ship James Oglethorpe, loaded with aircraft parts and machine tools. The ship's ammunition cargo detonated, blowing the vessel apart in an explosion that could be heard 10 miles away. U-91 torpedoed the tanker Southern Princess, sending 12,000 tons of aviation fuel up in flames that turned night into day. The burning oil spread across the water, creating a hell of fire that cremated the survivors trying to swim away from their sinking ship. McIntyre ordered star shells fired to illuminate the battlefield, but it only revealed the magnitude of the disaster. U-boats were everywhere, their conning towers cutting through the waves as they maneuvered for attack positions. The destroyer HMS Beverly spotted U-530 on the surface and opened fire with her 4-inch guns, but the submarine crash-dived before the shells found their mark. HMS Volunteer dropped a pattern of 10 depth charges where U-530 had submerged, the explosion sending geysers of water 100 feet into the air, but sonar contact was never regained. The submarine had escaped into the depths. The corvettes were overwhelmed trying to rescue survivors. HMS Anemone stopped to pick up men from the water, making herself a sitting target. U-444 fired 2 torpedoes at the stationary corvette but missed, the weapons passing just astern. The corvette immediately got underway, abandoning dozens of merchant seamen who were still in the water, their cries for help drowned out by the corvette's engines. It was the cruel arithmetic of convoy warfare. Stopping to rescue survivors meant risking your own ship and crew. Most captains chose to keep moving, throwing life rafts overboard and promising to come back later, knowing they never would. By dawn on March 17th, convoy HX-229 had lost 8 ships totaling 52,000 tons. The surviving merchant ships were scattered across 20 miles of ocean, some maintaining course for Liverpool, others reversing course for Newfoundland, most simply fleeing in whatever direction seemed safest. McIntyre spent the morning trying to reform the convoy, sending lamp signals and radio messages, threatening to report captains who didn't return to formation. Slowly, painfully, 31 merchant ships gathered back into some semblance of order. 9 ships were missing, either sunk or fled. But the U-boats hadn't finished. Throughout March 17th, they tracked the convoy, staying just beyond the horizon, surfacing briefly to fix the convoy's position before submerging again. B-Dienst intercepted and decoded McIntyre's radio reports to Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, giving the U-boats perfect intelligence on the convoy's route and escort strength. Admiral Donitz himself was directing the battle from U-boat command, moving submarines like chess pieces, concentrating the wolf packs for a decisive attack. The second night was worse than the first. 30 U-boats attacked in waves, some firing torpedoes from long range, others penetrating the escort screen to attack from within the convoy itself. U-221 surfaced between two columns of merchant ships and fired both bow and stern tubes simultaneously, sinking the freighter Canadian Star and damaging the tanker Sven Foyn. U-590 torpedoed the Liberty ship William Eustis, carrying Sherman tanks and ammunition. The tanks broke loose as the ship listed, crashing through bulkheads, their 30-ton weight accelerating the ship's death roll. The William Eustis capsized and sank in 7 minutes, taking all but 12 of her crew of 72 with her. The escort ships fought back desperately. HMS Volunteer detected U-632 on the surface and illuminated it with her searchlight. The destroyer's 4-inch guns opened fire, scoring at least one hit on the submarine's conning tower before it crash-dived. Volunteer dropped 14 depth charges in a tight pattern, and oil and debris rose to the surface. U-632 was never heard from again, one of the few U-boat casualties in the battle. But for every submarine damaged or driven off, 3 more took its place. The Liberty ship Irene DuPont, carrying 8,000 tons of ammunition and explosives, took a torpedo in her number 2 hold at 0215 hours on March 18th. The crew had exactly 30 seconds to abandon ship before the cargo detonated. The explosion was the largest of the battle, a brilliant white flash followed by a shock wave that knocked men off their feet 5 miles away. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the Irene DuPont except a few pieces of twisted metal floating on the surface. All 68 crew members were vaporized in the explosion. Chief Engineer Robert Patterson of the freighter Matthew Luckenbach would later describe the horror of that second night. The ocean was on fire. Everywhere you looked, ships were burning, exploding, sinking. The water was covered with oil, and men were swimming through it, their faces black, their eyes white with terror. We threw everything that would float over the side life rafts, wooden crates, even the mess tables, but we couldn't stop to pick anyone up. We could see the U-boats on the surface, maybe 3 or 4 of them, moving between the burning ships like wolves among sheep. We were doing 12 knots, maximum speed, zigzagging wildly, just praying a torpedo wouldn't find us. The Matthew Luckenbach survived, but many others didn't. The British freighter Corsaro, loaded with grain and lumber, took 2 torpedoes from U-610 and sank so quickly that no distress signal was sent. The entire crew of 44 men went down with the ship. The Dutch freighter Turco Lei, carrying bauxite ore for aluminum production, was torpedoed by U-665. The heavy cargo pulled the ship under in less than 4 minutes. 16 men made it into a lifeboat, but they were never found. They either died of exposure in the frigid Atlantic or their boat was swamped by the massive waves. HMS Pennywort, one of the escorting corvettes, detected a U-boat on the surface at 0340 hours and turned to ram. The corvette's bow struck U-444 at 15 knots, riding up over the submarine's hull. For a moment, the 2 vessels were locked together, the corvette's propellers churning air as her bow lifted out of the water. Then U-444 broke free and crash-dived, leaving a long oil slick on the surface. Pennywort dropped depth charges, but her astic was damaged in the collision, and she couldn't track the submarine. U-444 survived, limping back to France with a crushed pressure hull that leaked continuously. By dawn on March 18th, Convoy HX-229 had ceased to exist as an organized formation. The surviving merchant ships were scattered across 300 square miles of ocean. Some were still heading for Liverpool, others had turned back for North America, and a few were simply running south, hoping to escape the slaughter. McIntyre had lost contact with 2 of his corvettes. HMS Sherbrooke hadn't been heard from in 6 hours, and HMS Abelia was reporting that she was down to her last 4 depth charges. The destroyer HMS Beverly had developed engine problems and could only make 12 knots, too slow to chase U-boats or even keep up with the convoy. Western Approach's command in Liverpool was in crisis mode. The loss of HX-229 would be catastrophic for the war effort. The convoy was carrying 140,000 tons of aviation fuel, without which the RAF's bomber offensive against Germany would have to be curtailed. There were 10,000 tons of ammunition in the convoy, desperately needed for the fighting in North Africa. Most critically, the convoy carried food, wheat, meat, and sugar that Britain needed to survive. The country had only 6 weeks of food reserves remaining. If convoys continued to be slaughtered at this rate, Britain would face starvation by summer. Admiral Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, ordered every available escort vessel to sea to support HX-229. But the nearest reinforcements were 300 miles away, at least 20 hours steaming time. He also ordered Coastal Command to provide air cover, but the convoy was still in the Black Pit, the area of the mid-Atlantic beyond the range of land-based aircraft. The very long-range B-24 Liberators based in Iceland could just reach the convoy's position, but they would only have a few minutes on station before having to return for fuel. On the morning of March 18th, a single B-24 Liberator from 120 Squadron appeared over the convoy's scattered remnants. Flight Lieutenant Cyril Bircher had pushed his aircraft to its absolute range limit, flying for 7 hours through terrible weather to reach the convoy. He had enough fuel for maybe 30 minutes of patrol before having to turn back. In those 30 minutes, he spotted 4 U-boats on the surface and attacked U-221 with depth charges, forcing it to crash dive. The other U-boats also submerged at the sight of the aircraft. For a brief moment, the attack stopped. But Bircher couldn't stay. As his Liberator turned for home, engines running on fumes, the U-boats surfaced again. U-666, commanded by Oberleutnant Herbert Engel, torpedoed the freighter Port Auckland, carrying frozen meat from New Zealand. The refrigerated cargo holds filled with seawater, and the ship developed a 30-degree list. The crew abandoned ship in 3 lifeboats, but in the confusion, they failed to release the ship's cat, which could be heard crying as the vessel went under. It was a small detail amid such carnage, but one that haunted the survivors. U-333 attacked the tanker Benedict, loaded with 11,000 tons of fuel oil. The torpedo struck the engine room, killing everyone inside instantly. The fuel oil didn't explode like aviation gasoline, but it poured from the ruptured tanks, covering the sea in a thick, black sludge. Survivors who abandoned ship found themselves swimming through oil so thick they couldn't move their arms. Many drowned just yards from life rafts, pulled under by the weight of oil-soaked clothing. Others survived in the water only to die days later, their lungs destroyed by inhaled petroleum. The Liberty ship Walter Q. Gresham fought back. When U-663 surfaced 500 yards away to finish off another damaged merchant ship, the Gresham's naval armed guard opened fire with their 5-inch stern gun. The untrained gunners, most of whom had never fired at a real target before, managed to land a shell directly on U-663's conning tower. The explosion killed everyone on the submarine's bridge, including the captain, and the U-boat sank sternfirst in less than a minute. It was one of only 2 confirmed U-boat kills during the 3-day battle. As night fell on March 18th, the surviving ships of HX-229 were still 600 miles from the British Isles, still beyond effective air cover, still surrounded by U-boats. McIntyre had managed to gather 17 merchant ships into a loose formation, protected by Volunteer and 3 corvettes. But he knew the U-boats were still out there, tracking them, waiting for darkness. In his war diary he wrote, "Situation desperate. Have lost 22 merchants confirmed. Possibly more. Ammunition nearly exhausted. Request immediate assistance or convoy will be annihilated." The third night began with U-305 torpedoing the freighter Brant County, one of the few ships still maintaining station in the convoy formation. The torpedo struck the ship's ammunition cargo, and the explosion broke the freighter in half. The bow section sank immediately, but the stern section remained afloat for almost an hour, its lights still burning. The radio operator continuously sending SOS until the water finally reached the radio room. 38 men died. 7 survived by clinging to a life raft for 18 hours until HMS Anemone found them. U-539 attacked what it thought was a large tanker but turned out to be the rescue ship Zamalek, a converted passenger liner designated to pick up survivors. The Zamalek had already rescued 167 survivors from previously sunken ships, and her decks were crowded with wounded merchant seamen. The torpedo struck amidships, and the ship began settling rapidly. The crew and rescued survivors had to abandon ship for the second time in 3 days. Many of the wounded couldn't make it off the ship. They went down with the Zamalek, entombed in her hospital ward. The slaughter continued through the night. U-441 torpedoed the freighter Empire Knight, carrying aircraft engines and spare parts. U-618 sank the Norwegian tanker Glitter, sending another 10,000 tons of fuel oil into the Atlantic. U-190 put 2 torpedoes into the Liberty ship Harry Luckenbach, loaded with trucks and tanks. Each sinking added more oil to the water, more debris to dodge, more men crying for help in the darkness. By dawn on March 19th, the ocean around the convoy's position was a hellscape. The water was covered with oil, some of it still burning, sending up clouds of black smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. Debris was everywhere: wooden crates, life rafts, pieces of ships, and bodies. Hundreds of bodies, some in life jackets, some without, all frozen solid in the 28-degree water. Seabirds descended on the corpses, pecking at exposed flesh, their cries adding to the horror of the scene. But on March 19th, salvation finally arrived. The convoy had finally reached the range of effective air cover from bases in Northern Ireland. Sunderland flying boats from 201 Squadron appeared overhead, their arrival announced by depth charges dropped on U-boats caught on the surface. B-17 flying fortresses from 206 Squadron joined the patrol, their heavy bomb loads converted to depth charges. The U-boats were forced to submerge and stay submerged, unable to surface to recharge batteries or achieve attacking positions. More importantly, reinforcements from Western Approaches Command finally arrived. The destroyers HMS Highlander and HMS Vimy appeared on the horizon, racing at 30 knots to join the escort. Behind them came 4 more corvettes and 2 frigates. The balance of power had shifted. The U-boats could no longer attack with impunity. When U-631 tried to surface for an attack, HMS Highlander immediately detected it and attacked with depth charges. Oil and debris rose to the surface, along with German bodies. U-631 was destroyed with all hands. Admiral Donitz recognized that the battle was over. With strong air cover and reinforced surface escorts, his U-boats could no longer effectively attack. He ordered the wolf packs to break off and disperse. The U-boats slipped away into the vastness of the Atlantic, leaving behind them a trail of destruction unprecedented in the war at sea. In 3 days and nights of battle, they had sunk 22 merchant ships totaling 146,596 tons. They had killed over 850 merchant seamen and naval personnel. Only 1 U-boat had been confirmed destroyed, with 2 others possibly damaged. The survivors of Convoy HX-229 limped into Liverpool on March 22, 1943. Only 18 of the original 40 merchant ships made it to port. The docks were lined with ambulances and hearses. Wounded survivors were carried off on stretchers, their oil-blackened faces masks of exhaustion and trauma. Many were suffering from hypothermia, frostbite, and petroleum poisoning. The psychological casualties were even worse. Men who had spent hours in the water listening to their shipmates drown, who had been machine-gunned in lifeboats, who had watched their ships explode with friends still aboard, were broken by the experience. Captain Donald McIntyre of HMS Volunteer was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership during the battle, but he took no pride in it. In his report to the Admiralty, he wrote, "The convoy system has failed. We cannot protect the merchant ships with the forces available. Unless something changes dramatically, we will lose the Battle of the Atlantic, and with it, the war." The Admiralty agreed. The loss of HX-229, combined with the near-simultaneous destruction of Convoy SC-122, which lost 9 ships to the same wolf packs, represented the nadir of the Battle of the Atlantic. In March 1943 alone, the Allies lost 120 ships totaling 693,389 tons. At that rate, Britain would be starved into submission within months. The U-boats were winning. But the disaster of HX-229 also marked a turning point. The Admiralty realized that incremental improvements weren't enough. They needed revolutionary changes to defeat the U-boat menace. Within 2 months, those changes were implemented. Support groups of destroyers and frigates were created, able to reinforce threatened convoys. Escort carriers were introduced, providing air cover throughout the Atlantic crossing. Most importantly, centimetric radar was fitted to all escort vessels, allowing them to detect surfaced U-boats at night and in fog. The technology of war shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. The new Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar could fire 24 bombs ahead of an attacking escort, eliminating the blind spot in ASTIC coverage. The Lee light allowed aircraft to illuminate and attack U-boats caught on the surface at night. High-frequency direction finding, HF/DF or HUF-DUF, allowed escorts to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions, pinpointing their locations. And finally, the breaking of the German Enigma code gave the Allies advance warning of U-boat positions and intentions. Captain Daniel V. Gallery of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, who would later capture U-505, described the transformation. In March 1943, the U-boats were hunting us. By May 1943, we were hunting them. The technology changed, the tactics changed, but most importantly, the numbers changed. We went from never having enough escorts to having support groups specifically dedicated to hunting U-boats. We went from gaps in air cover to continuous coverage from escort carriers. The hunters became the hunted. The transformation was dramatic. In May 1943, just 2 months after the slaughter of HX-229, the Allies sank 41 U-boats while losing only 50 merchant ships. Dönitz called it Black May, and temporarily withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic. The wolf pack tactics that had nearly brought Britain to its knees were abandoned. The U-boats would continue to fight until the end of the war, but never again would they threaten to sever the Atlantic lifeline. For the survivors of HX-229, the memory of those 3 nights in March 1943 never faded. Able seaman James Thompson of the Matthew Luckenbach suffered nightmares for the rest of his life. "I still see them," he said in an interview 40 years later. "The men in the water, covered in oil, crying for help. We couldn't stop. We had to leave them there to die. I see the ships burning, the explosions lighting up the night. I hear the sound of torpedoes hitting, that metallic clang followed by the explosion. I smell the oil and the smoke and the fear." Chief Officer William Henderson of the Port Auckland, who survived 27 hours in an open lifeboat, never went to sea again. "When we were finally picked up by a Canadian corvette, I swore I would never set foot on another ship. The ocean had become a graveyard. Every wave might hide a periscope. Every piece of driftwood might be a mine. Every night brought terror. I'd faced the wolf packs and survived, but I knew my luck couldn't last forever." The merchant seamen who survived HX-229 received little recognition for their sacrifice. They weren't military personnel, so they received no medals for valor. They were civilians who had volunteered or been conscripted to sail through the most dangerous waters on Earth, carrying the supplies that kept Britain fighting. They faced the same dangers as naval personnel, actually greater dangers, since merchant ships were the primary targets, but received none of the glory. The statistics tell only part of the story. Between 1939 and 1945, 3,500 merchant vessels were lost, and 72,200 merchant seamen died, a casualty rate higher than any military service. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, lasting from the first day to the last day of the war in Europe. It was fought in the worst conditions imaginable: mountainous seas, Arctic cold, perpetual darkness in winter, fog, and storms that could sink a ship as surely as any torpedo. But behind the statistics were individual stories of heroism and horror. Captain Edward White of the Liberty ship James Oglethorpe, who went down with his ship rather than abandon the wounded men trapped below decks. Radio officer Stanley Roberts of the Irene DuPont, who stayed at his post sending distress signals until the ammunition cargo exploded. Third engineer Michael O'Brien of the Southern Princess, who returned to the engine room 3 times to rescue injured crew members, suffering severe burns that would plague him for the rest of his life. The German submariners also paid a terrible price. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 28,000 died, a casualty rate of 70%. They called themselves the Iron Coffins, knowing that their chances of survival were minimal. When depth charges exploded around a submerged U-boat, the pressure hull would flex and groan, bolts would shear off and ricochet through the compartments like bullets, and the lights would fail, leaving the crew in absolute darkness hundreds of feet beneath the surface. Corvettenkapitän Gerhard Feiler of U-653, who had made the first contact with HX-229, survived the war but was haunted by his actions. In a post-war interview, he said, "We were told we were fighting a tonnage war, that ships were targets, not the men on them. But when you watch a torpedoed ship sink and know that 50 men are trapped inside, when you see survivors in the water and can't rescue them because it would endanger your boat, when you hear their cries over the hydrophones as they drown, these things stay with you. We were all victims of that terrible war at sea." The Battle of the Atlantic was won not through superior technology alone, but through the courage of ordinary men who faced extraordinary danger. The merchant seamen who sailed knowing that U-boats were waiting for them. The escort crews who fought against overwhelming odds to protect the convoys. The airmen who flew to the limit of their range to provide a few precious minutes of air cover. Even the U-boat crews, following orders in a cause that was ultimately doomed. The breakthrough in defeating the U-boats came through a combination of factors, but the human element remained crucial. Commander Frederick John Walker, the most successful U-boat hunter of the war, credited his success not to technology but to understanding his enemy. "The U-boat commander is a man like me," he said. "He has the same fears, the same need to sleep, the same mechanical problems with his boat. If I can think like him, anticipate his moves, I can defeat him." Walker's second support group sank more U-boats than any other formation, but even he recognized the terrible nature of the conflict. After sinking U-264 with all hands, he wrote in his diary, "50 young men died today by my hand. They were the enemy, and I did my duty, but I take no joy in it. They died terribly, crushed by water pressure or drowned in diesel oil. Their mothers will never know exactly how they died, only that they are missing. This is the reality of war at sea. No glory, no heroics, just death in the cold, dark Atlantic." The convoy system, despite disasters like HX-229, ultimately succeeded. Of the approximately 100,000 voyages made by individual merchant ships in Atlantic convoys, only about 1,500 were sunk. The convoys delivered 165 million tons of cargo to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations. Without these supplies, Britain would have starved, the Soviet Union would have collapsed, and the invasion of Europe would have been impossible. But success came at a terrible cost. Each sunken merchant ship represented not just lost cargo but lost lives. Each torpedo that found its mark meant men burned alive in oil fires, froze to death in lifeboats, or were pulled down with their ships into the black depths of the Atlantic. The bodies were rarely recovered. They remain on the ocean floor, along with the wrecks of their ships, monuments to the savagery of the Battle of the Atlantic. The lessons learned from disasters like HX-229 transformed naval warfare. The integration of air and sea power, the development of sophisticated detection equipment, the importance of intelligence and code-breaking, all emerged from the bitter experience of the convoy battles. The modern Navy's emphasis on anti-submarine warfare, the development of nuclear submarines, the creation of maritime patrol aircraft, all have their roots in the Battle of the Atlantic. In March 1993, on the 50th anniversary of the HX-229 disaster, a memorial service was held in Liverpool. Only 17 survivors attended, old men now, many in wheelchairs. They threw wreaths into the Mersey River for their shipmates who never came home. Captain McIntyre, then 91 years old, gave the eulogy. "We were ordinary men asked to do an impossible job: protect 40 merchant ships with 6 escorts against 30 U-boats. We failed. But in our failure, we learned. And because we learned, we eventually won. But the cost was more than anyone should have to pay." The last survivor of the HX-229 battle, able seaman Robert Davies of the Matthew Luckenbach, died in 2012 at the age of 93. With his death, the living memory of those 3 terrible nights in March 1943 passed into history. But the lessons remain. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that wars are won not just by weapons and technology, but by the courage of individuals facing impossible odds. It proved that the sea is an unforgiving battlefield where there are no foxholes to hide in, no retreat possible, only the vast, cold ocean waiting to claim those who fail. Today, the North Atlantic shipping lanes that were once the most dangerous waters on Earth are peaceful highways of commerce. Container ships and tankers cross in days what took convoys weeks to traverse. They sail directly, without zigzagging, without escorts, without fear of torpedoes in the night. GPS navigation has replaced the sextant, satellite communication has replaced the Aldous lamp, and the wolf packs exist only in history books and the nightmares of very old men. But on certain nights, when the North Atlantic storms rage and the waves tower over the ship's bridges, merchant seamen still think about HX 229 and the thousands of other convoys that sailed these waters. They remember that beneath them, scattered across the ocean floor, lie the wrecks of over 3,000 merchant ships and 800 U-boats, the graves of over 100,000 men who died in the longest and perhaps most decisive battle of World War II. The story of Convoy HX 229 is not unique. Similar disasters befell SC-122, ONS-5, SC-7, and dozens of other convoys. Each has its own tale of heroism and horror, of technology and terror, of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances. But HX-229 stands out because it represented the absolute nadir of the Battle of the Atlantic, the moment when it seemed the U-boats had won, when the convoy system appeared to have failed, when Britain's survival hung by a thread. Yet from that disaster came determination. From defeat came innovation. From the loss of 22 ships and 850 men came the resolve to never let it happen again. Within 2 months, the tide had turned decisively against the U-boats. The wolf packs that had savaged HX-229 were themselves hunted to extinction. Of the 30 U-boats that participated in the attack on HX-229, only 6 survived the war. The German U-boat arm never recovered from the defeats of May 1943. They continued to fight with desperate courage, but the technological and numerical advantages had shifted decisively to the Allies. Acoustic homing torpedoes hunted U-boats from the air. Escort carriers provided continuous air cover. Support groups of destroyers and frigates hunted U-boats with relentless efficiency. The introduction of the schnorkel allowed U-boats to remain submerged for longer periods, but it also made them slower and less effective. By 1945, going to sea in a U-boat was virtually a death sentence. The last U-boat to be sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic was U-320, destroyed by HMS Amethyst on May 7, 1945, just hours before Germany's surrender. The submarine went down with all 44 hands, adding to the toll of 28,000 German submariners who died in the war. They were mostly young men, some as young as 17, who had volunteered for what they thought would be a glamorous service but found instead only death in the cold Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic officially ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's surrender. Admiral Dönitz, who would become Germany's leader after Hitler's suicide, ordered all U-boats to surface, report their positions, and proceed to Allied ports to surrender. Over 150 U-boats were still operational, scattered across the world's oceans. Most complied with the order, but some chose instead to scuttle their boats, and 2, U-530 and U-977, fled to Argentina, sparking decades of speculation about escaped Nazi officials. The final accounting of the Battle of the Atlantic is staggering. The Allies lost 3,500 merchant vessels and 175 warships. The Germans lost 783 U-boats. Over 100,000 men died. The vast majority drowned or frozen in the North Atlantic. The material cost ran into billions of dollars. But the strategic impact was even greater. The Battle of the Atlantic was the prerequisite for all other Allied operations in Europe. Without victory at sea, there could be no victory on land. Winston Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." He understood what many did not. That Britain's survival depended entirely on the Atlantic convoy routes. If the U-boats had succeeded in severing those routes, Britain would have been forced to surrender, and the entire course of World War II would have changed. For the survivors of HX-229 and the thousands of other convoys that crossed the Atlantic during the war, the experience left indelible marks. Many never went to sea again, traumatized by their experiences. Others returned to the merchant marine, sailing the same routes they had during the war, but now in peace. They formed associations and held reunions, gathering to remember shipmates who didn't make it home, to share stories that only they could understand, to find solace in the company of others who had faced the wolf packs and survived. The Merchant Navy Association erected memorials in ports around the world, simple stones bearing the inscription, "For those who have no grave but the sea," every year on Merchant Navy Day, September 3rd, the anniversary of the first merchant ship sunk in World War II. Ceremonies are held to remember the forgotten service of the merchant seamen. They are attended by fewer veterans each year, as time claims those who survived where U-boats could not. The last reunion of HX-229 survivors was held in 2008. Only 4 men attended, all in their late 80s or 90s. They met in a Liverpool hotel overlooking the docks where their convoy had been meant to arrive 65 years earlier. They raised a glass to absent friends, to ships that never arrived, to young men who never grew old. They told stories, some for the last time, about those 3 nights when the wolf packs attacked, when the ocean burned, when they were already dead but somehow survived. Today, as global commerce depends more than ever on maritime trade, the lessons of the Battle of the Atlantic remain relevant. The vulnerability of sea lanes, the importance of naval escorts, the integration of air and sea power, all remain crucial to maritime security. Pirates off Somalia, tensions in the South China Sea, threats to oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, all echo the challenges faced in the Atlantic during World War II. Modern navies train extensively in anti-submarine warfare, using lessons learned from battles like HX-229. Nuclear submarines, far more capable than the U-boats of World War II, patrol the oceans, but the basic principles remain the same. Control of the sea lanes determines global power. The technology has advanced beyond recognition, nuclear propulsion, guided missiles, satellite surveillance, but the human element remains paramount. It still takes courage to go to sea in wartime, to face an unseen enemy beneath the waves, to protect the vulnerable merchant ships that carry the world's commerce. The story of Convoy HX-229 is ultimately a human story. Not of admirals and strategy, though they played their part. Not of technology and code-breaking, though they were crucial. But of ordinary men, British, American, Norwegian, Dutch, Canadian, and yes, German too, who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. Men who faced their fears, did their duty, and paid the ultimate price. Men who sailed into the wolf packs knowing they were surrounded, knowing they were already dead, but sailing on anyway because that was their job, their duty, their contribution to victory. As the last veterans of the Battle of the Atlantic pass away, it becomes more important than ever to remember their sacrifice. The young men who sailed in Convoy HX-229, who died in the cold Atlantic waters in March 1943, who burned in torpedoed tankers, who froze in open lifeboats, who went down with their ships, deserve to be remembered. They were not professional warriors but civilian sailors who answered their nation's call. They faced the same dangers as any soldier or sailor but received little recognition for their service. The memorial at Tower Hill in London bears the names of 24,000 British merchant seamen who died in World War II and have no grave but the sea. Similar memorials exist in Halifax, New York, Oslo, Amsterdam, and other ports that sent men to sea during the war. They are simple monuments to an epic struggle, markers for men whose bodies were never recovered, whose final moments were spent in the cold, dark Atlantic, victims of a battle that had to be won regardless of cost. The convoy system that seemed to fail so catastrophically with HX-229 ultimately proved its worth. Despite the losses, despite disasters like March 1943, the convoys got through. Britain survived, was able to serve as the launching pad for the invasion of Europe, and helped secure Allied victory. The mathematics were brutal but simple. As long as more ships arrived than were sunk, as long as supplies continued to flow, the Allies would win. The U-boats made them pay a terrible price, but they paid it. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was won by the courage of men who knew the odds were against them but sailed anyway. The merchant seamen who signed on for another voyage knowing that U-boats were waiting. The escort crews who fought against overwhelming numbers to protect their charges. The airmen who flew beyond safety margins to provide cover. Even the U-boat crews, following orders they knew would likely lead to their deaths. All were participants in the longest, most crucial, and perhaps most terrible campaign of World War II. When we remember World War II, we think of D-Day, the Battle of Britain, Stalingrad, Pearl Harbor, dramatic battles with clear outcomes. But the Battle of the Atlantic was different. It was fought every day for nearly 6 years, in weather conditions that ranged from terrible to impossible, against an enemy that struck from beneath the waves without warning. It was a battle of attrition, of statistics, of tonnage sunk versus tonnage delivered. But for the men who fought it, it was intensely personal. The friend who didn't make it to the lifeboat, the ship that exploded alongside, the cries for help that couldn't be answered. Convoy HX-229's sacrifice was not in vain. The disaster shocked the Allied leadership into implementing the changes that would defeat the U-boats. The deaths of 850 men in 3 nights led directly to innovations that saved thousands more. The loss of 22 ships proved that the existing system was inadequate and forced the rapid deployment of new technologies and tactics. In war, sadly, it often takes disaster to drive necessary change. As we mark the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Atlantic, few veterans remain to tell their stories. The men who survived HX-229 are gone, their voices silenced by time. But their story remains, a testament to human courage in the face of overwhelming odds, a reminder of the price of freedom, a warning about the vulnerability of maritime commerce. They sailed into history on that March night in 1943, 40 merchant ships heading into the wolf packs, most of them never to return. The North Atlantic is a vast cemetery, its floor littered with the wrecks of ships and submarines, the remains of men who died far from home. No flowers mark their graves, no headstones bear their names. They rest in the eternal darkness of the deep ocean, German and Allied together, united in death as they were divided in life. They are the forgotten casualties of a forgotten battle, but their sacrifice made possible the world we live in today. Remember them. Remember Convoy HX-229. Remember the night the wolf packs attacked, when the ocean burned, when merchant seamen faced impossible odds and sailed on anyway. Remember that freedom has a price, and that price was paid in full by ordinary men doing extraordinary things in the cold, cruel Atlantic. They knew they were surrounded, knew they were already dead, but they sailed on anyway. That was their courage. That was their victory. That is their legacy.